Ecclesiastes chapter 8. And I may not cover everything I intended to originally, but we want to get through this chapter and understand Ecclesiastes chapter 8. It begins, "Who is the wise man? And who knoweth the interpretation of a thing?" And that's sort of what the theme of Ecclesiastes is. Who really can be wise? And we're going to see at the end of the chapter, he's going to tell us no one can really know. That is, finding out wisdom on their own. We're not here long enough and we're not wise enough to do it. We depend on God. But he does say this, a man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. I thought I had a good way to teach that to the class this morning. I told everyone in there, I said, now just have a good stern, hard look on your face, like you're really confused and worried about something. And you know what they did? All they could do is sit there and grin. They couldn't do it. But you think about that. Who has not seen someone struggle over a problem, and then all of a sudden, I get in their face just lights up when they understand it. And that kind of illustrates what we're talking about. Sometimes you can tell a man knows what he's talking about and that a man understands a thing by his face. His face will just shine because he has that confidence about him. And when it talks about the boldness of his face, I want you to think of that stern look and that hardness, but that'll change when a man has wisdom. Now it goes from that and into this next part, but I want us to remind us some things we read about in the New Testament that go right along with what's going to follow here in Ecclesiastes. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers. The powers that be are ordained of God. The rulers are not a terror of good works, but to evil. Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. If thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. He's a minister of God. Wherefore you need to be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. Now that's not that entire passage, but I think that's enough to get the gist of what Paul is teaching us in Romans. Well, that's what Solomon is teaching us in Ecclesiastes. I want you to remember this preacher in Ecclesiastes was the king. And so here's what the king says. Let me show you this. Daniel, you can't always obey the higher authorities. You remember that time Daniel was told to bow down before the idol and he wouldn't, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego they wouldn't do it. They went to the fiery furnace. Now the Lord delivered them, but they said even if he doesn't, we're going to have to serve the Lord. And remember how Peter said we ought to obey God rather than man. And so this power that civil authorities has is not absolute. It's still subject to God. But we got to remember we're supposed to obey the civil authorities. And so Solomon says this, I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment. And that in regard to the oath of God. That could be because God is talking about how God's put them in place, but I really think this may be talking about the oath you take when you declare your subjection to the king. When I served as a civil servant in the Department of Agriculture, they swore me in. You saw them swear in the presidents and the vice president in this inauguration. Well, you take an oath before God. It says, yeah, I'm going to obey the laws of the land and implement those laws the best of my ability. And then we say, so help me God. Now that's an oath you take. And so when it comes to the king's commandments, if you're subject to the king, you remember that. You have already promised. You're going to try to do what the king wants you to do. So be not hasty to go out of his sight. You ever had someone try to do something around behind your back? Don't do the king that way. Don't try to get around behind his back. And stand not in an evil thing. He doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. See, in Solomon's day, the king had absolute authority. There was no judge you could take the king before and said, okay, I'm going to overrule the king. That didn't happen. The king was the absolute monarch. He could do what he pleased. So you really want to do well before the king. And it says, Where the word of a king is, there is power, and who may say to him, what doest thou? Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing. And a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment, because to every purpose there is a time and judgment. King asks you to do something. What if the king asks you to do something foolish? We don't just say, well, king, that's foolish. That would not be good judgment. And if it's before others, it wouldn't be a good time. Maybe what you could do is go before the king later and say, look, king, maybe here's something else we could do. But don't do anything to undermine the king's authority or to make the king look bad. And so use some judgment here. And think of your timing here when you're in council with the king. And so therefore, the misery of man is great upon him, for he knoweth not what shall be, for who can tell him when it shall be? It's hard to know the best time. It's hard to use good judgment. And we really don't know what tomorrow holds. Neither us, nor does the king. And so this is the misery we're talking about, that uncertainty we have to deal with on how things are going to work out in the future. But then he says this, even though he's king, there's certain things a king can't do. There is no man that hath power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit. What's he talking about? He tells us in the next line. Neither hath he power in the day of death. And there's no discharge in that war. Neither shall wickedness deliver those that are given to it. You see, we're going to die. Even the king can't prevent that. And the king can't even prevent his own death. And in view of the fact that the king, though he may have absolute power, he doesn't have it eternally. He's going to give that power up to whoever comes after him. And the king is going to be held accountable for his actions as well when he dies. And so he says this, all this have I seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under sun. There is a time wherein one man ruleth over another to his own hurt. You see, the king may have absolute authority, but he's not infallible. And the way he rules over others can actually result in his own hurt by the way he does that. And so it takes discretion and judgment. And that may be you can't always do what the king says, but don't be hasty about that. You be careful if you're going to conflict with the king. And so he drifts from that into this other topic here. God's going to judge. And in the end, he's going to set everything right. I also saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had done so. The fact that the wicked is buried, remember how we talked about the man with the many, many children and he did not have a burial at his death? And yet the wicked man gets buried. How can it be that a wicked man can have an honorable funeral? After he's done his wickedness, he can still go in and out of the holy place and people just forget about it and it looks like he gets by with that wickedness. Let me tell you, he doesn't. It might look like he got by with it, but he doesn't. He says, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set on them to do evil. They think they're going to get by. They got by with some wickedness and the sentence didn't come immediately. And God did not immediately punish even the wicked king. Did he get by with it? They might think they could get by with it because the punishment doesn't immediately follow. But they're misunderstanding God's delay here. We read in the New Testament, the Lord's not slack concerning his promise. He's long-suffering. He doesn't want anyone to perish. He wants us to come to repentance. But then in Romans 2, 4 through 6, he talks about, do you despise the riches and goodness and forbearance and long-suffering of God? Now to despise that means you don't give that much credit. You don't give that much count. Here's why God's delaying. He doesn't want to punish you. He's giving you a chance to get things right. And so he says the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance. But after thy hardness and impenitent heart, treasures up unto thyself wrath against the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to every man according to his deeds. So don't think, because the judgment does not come speedily upon evil, that anyone is getting away with anything. It says, though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. There'll come a time when God will take all this into account. God will set everything right. Okay, let's go to the next one. And that is how man really cannot know wisdom. You're not going to figure this out on your own. And there are some things that you just can't figure out, and it doesn't look like this ought to be this way to you. And what Solomon is going to tell you here is, don't let that ruin your life. Don't let it rob your joy. You've got joys in life, go ahead and enjoy. You don't have to solve all these problems. And don't let it take sleep from your eyes. This is a vanity which is done on the earth, that there be just men to whom it happeneth according to the work of the wicked. And there be wicked men to whom it happeneth according to the work of the righteous. And I said, this also is vanity. How do you explain that? Well, you may not be able to explain that. He says, I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and be merry, for that shall abide with him of his labor in the days of his life, which God giveth him under the sun. Just if you can't figure it out, don't let it spoil your day. Go ahead and have a good day and enjoy the blessings God given you. And don't lose sleep over this. I mean, it's troublesome, isn't it? But don't lose sleep over it. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done upon the earth, for also there is that neither day nor night seeth sleep with his eyes, that I beheld the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. Because though a man labor to seek it out, yet he shall not find it. Yea, further, though a wise man think to know it, yet he shall not be able to find it. There's going to be things in this life that just don't seem right. And you could rack your brains trying to rationalize and understand this. And Solomon is telling you here, the preacher's telling you here, just you can't do that. Don't let it ruin your good days. Don't lose a lot of sleep over this. Now, he's already told us, God's going to deal with this. God's got this. And you don't have to understand it. It's really one of the great blessings that we have with our faith, is that we're able to take things to God in prayer. I'm just going to leave it in the hands of God. And I don't have to fix it, because it's beyond my power to do so. God can take that, and we can just leave it in his hands. It tells us in Isaiah 55, verses 6 through 9, seek the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts, and let him return unto the Lord. And he'll have mercy on him and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. But then he says, for our thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And so in our observations we make about life, to us, some of it just not going to make any sense. But God knows. He's aware. And he knows what he's doing. And we can leave that safely in the hands of God. Now, here's the memory work. Ecclesiastes 8, verses 12 through 13. Now, the highlighted part, I'm not giving you clues about the test coming up with the clues. I just wanted you to make sure you notice this in the memory work. Though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged, yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God, which fear before him. But it shall not be well with the wicked, neither shall he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he feareth not before God. The preacher is in the midst of his sermon. And what we're seeing him do right now, he's developing that theme. And more you're going to see him referring back to this fear God. Fear God. You better fear God. And we know how the sermon ends. The last 2 verses of the book. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God. And keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So you see how the preacher is bringing us to that conclusion in the midst of his lesson, don't you? Okay, that's the lesson for tonight. And what I want you to do is fear God, keep his commandments. Now, there's no sense in arguing about this. The Lord's told us what we must do to be saved. We might say, well, I don't think it ought to be that way, or it doesn't make sense to me, or I would have done it something else. Listen, that's not for you to do. God says you need to believe, hear, believe, and obey the gospel. That means you got to turn from your sin and confess his name before men and be baptized into Christ and live your life in accordance with his teachings. Now, that's not hard to understand what God said. You might rationalize and think, well, it seems like it ought not be that way, or shouldn't be that narrow, or ought to allow for this. But look, that's not for you. Fear God and keep his commandments. And so I extend the invitation. I don't care how bad the weather is. If you got a need to respond, that's our priority. And we'll take care of that tonight as we sing this invitation song.